As we now move into the second half of the semester, we begin with the period known as the Enlightenment, the beginning of modernity. And our two primary thinkers that we'll be exploring in this lecture will be Rene Descartes and also John Locke.
The impetus for this Enlightenment age beginning is typically credited to what is referred to as the 30 Years' War. That is from 1618 to 1648. And this was throughout Europe, and it was primarily a war between Protestants and Catholics. Now, not just because of religious arguments between these two groups, but also we had local city governments and also national governments were vying to either be Catholic or Protestant. So realize that this is not strictly a religious war because the religion is so intertwined with the politics of the day. But it is basically a war of Roman Catholics versus Protestants. Now, by the time we get to the end of the 30 Years' War, we have some questions that I like to say are now being shouted or screamed, whereas they were only whispered about 300 years ago. Because 300 years prior to this 30 Years' War is when Europe experienced the Black Death, that some historians believe decimated about 1/3 of the population of all of Europe. Now, this was a plague that many of you know was carried by rat fleas. It's believed that these rats migrated from Asia into the area that we call Turkey today and then into the rest of Europe. And this plague caused the death of many, many people. And those who survived noticed how indiscriminate this plague was, that it killed the young and the old, that it killed people of all different races. And so people began asking the question, if this sort of tragedy can happen in our world, what does this say about God? Does it mean that God even exists? Does it mean that God is good? And if so, how could God be good and allow such terrible things to happen? And also, by the time we get to the 30 Years' War after this plague, 300 years later, because the war is between Protestants and Catholics, and both groups, of course, being religious people, Christian people, and they're killing one another, people begin asking the question, if anyone really does know about God, who is that person? Who has the authority to tell us what to believe about God or what to believe about religion? And as I think you can see, these kind of questions relate back to the issue of theodicy that we looked at in a previous lecture. And so now we move forward into this Enlightenment period, and we see some new philosophical schools develop, and many of these philosophical teachings are going to deal with questions about authority. It's no longer going to be viable to claim that because this group is called the Church, or because this group has a collection of books called Holy Scripture, that these things tell us directly about God and directly about knowledge and truth. Instead, these philosophers, and by the way, most of these philosophers still believe in a divinity figure, still believe in a God-type figure, but rather than looking at scriptures or the church to be the authority about God, they're going to insist upon reason or observation. And so what you're going to see in the two philosophers that we look at in this lecture is the same dynamic that you saw all the way back with Plato and Aristotle, that one philosopher is going to turn inward to the world of ideas to try to discover truth, and the other philosopher, like Aristotle, is going to turn outward to the world of observation and believes through perception and observation that is how we determine knowledge. So I think it's interesting that even though here we are over 1,000 years after Plato and Aristotle, we see this same tension or same dynamic within philosophy, this question of do you turn inward for knowledge or do you turn outward? Our primary first thinker for this Enlightenment or modern period is Rene Descartes. And Descartes proposes a philosophy that we refer to as rationalism, and oftentimes you will hear any sort of talk of Descartes' teaching called Cartesian philosophy. He was French, and although he certainly did write in Latin, which was the language of the scholars, he is more noted for writing in the French language, the language of the people, and so therefore they were able to have access to his works. And he was not some sort of ivory tower philosopher that the people didn't have access to. He was a philosopher of the people, and they appreciated the fact that they did have access to his works and that they could read them in their own language. In his Discourse on Method, Descartes refers to innate ideas, these ideas of absolute truth and knowledge that we have within us that are part of what it is to be a human being. But unfortunately, these innate ideas become distorted or skewed over the time of our lives through the experiences that we have had. And so we develop some preconceived notions, some biases, some presuppositions, and all of these experiences, again, they distort, they damage these innate ideas that we have within us. And so the role of the philosopher, according to Descartes, is that we have to learn to move past those presuppositions and those biases to, in a way, erase them from our souls, from our minds, so that we can discover these innate ideas. Now, Descartes referred to this arrival at a place of being able to access your innate ideas as the tabula rasa, which means the blank slate. So imagine a very messy chalkboard, and you have to clean that board. You have to get rid of all the chalk dust, all of the markings, and finally, once you get to the blank slate, you can see and discover these innate ideas with which you were born. And once you have the discovery of these innate ideas, we have Descartes giving us an image that becomes very familiar for all of Enlightenment thinking about knowledge or truth. And that is, whatever the innate idea is becomes a foundation that cannot be doubted. It is a firm foundation, and upon that foundation that you are absolutely certain is true, you then begin to build an edifice or a tower of all other knowledge or truth upon that foundation. So that concept of building truth upon a foundation, an unshakable foundation, is very common to all of Enlightenment thinking. Well, what was Descartes' foundation? Well, his primary innate idea is referred to in the Latin as cogito ergo sum, which translated into English means I think, therefore I am. And this becomes the primary justification for the philosophy of rationalism, that existence is marked by thinking, that if a being is a thinking being, that means that he, she, it actually has existence. Descartes' next step after this is to say, as a thinking being who actually exists, he also has another thought, a thought of a being who is far better than him, a perfect being. And because he has this thought of a perfect being, it means that being must actually exist, and that being would be God, would be divinity. Ironically, this is not a new idea. 500 years prior to Descartes, a teacher in the church named Anselm of Canterbury is one who turned inward for his discovery of a divine being or God, and over against what would later be the cosmological argument of Aquinas that you've already learned about. This is called the ontological argument for the existence of God, that because you have the thought of a perfect being, one who is far greater than you, it means that being must exist. And of course there are many, many arguments that can be made against that, but that is nonetheless called the ontological argument for the existence of God. Now, the primary struggle that Descartes could never overcome, and for decades, even centuries afterwards, his students would try to overcome, was his disconnection between the material world, or the physical body, and this realm of thinking that marks existence. Descartes never could bring these two together, the realm of thinking and the physical world or the physical body. Now, two terms that your author does not provide you with that I want you to know are res cogitans and res extensa, and these are the terms in Latin that refer to this disconnection. Res cogitans is the realm of thinking, okay, the invisible inward world, And Descartes never could connect that to res extensa, which is the material world, including the physical body. So res cogitans, res extensa, the realm of thinking, and the physical world, the physical body, these two things could never be connected in Cartesian rationalism. And now, less than a full generation after the time of Rene Descartes, we come to John Locke. And just as we saw with Plato and Aristotle, Plato turning inward to the realm of forms, perfect forms, and Aristotle turning outward, of course, trying to find knowledge through observation of the world. We have Descartes turning inward like Plato, but John Locke is one who will turn outward to the physical world to try to observe through his senses what is taking place, and therefore coming up with what would be knowledge. So sense experience, which you all know, of course, things like sight and hearing and touch and taste and smell, these senses are the way that we take in the world, and through these sense experiences we do have ideas that come about through this observation, and that's how we arrive at knowledge or truth. Very important term for you to know is that this is called empiricism, okay? Knowledge through observation of the world through sense experience. And so when we come to this Enlightenment period, these become our two primary competing philosophies: the inward turn of rationalism with Descartes, and the outward turn for observation through empiricism that we have with John Locke. Now, Locke argued that what our senses observe in any immediate moment, that gives us knowledge of what exists, but it only gives us knowledge of what exists in that actual moment. So as of this moment right now, I am sitting in front of my computer. I can touch my computer, so that's the sense of touch. I can see my computer, and so my computer I know actually exists in this very moment. But later on this evening, I will go into my living room and I will probably watch a movie or a television show, but my computer will still be in here in my office. So I won't actually have immediate sense experience that my computer exists in that moment. And so John Locke talked about what he called knowledge through probability, or existence through probability. That even though I'll be in my living room and I can't actually see my computer in a couple of hours, I still know it is very, very probable that my computer does exist in the other room, and I could just walk back there and see it, and then I would have immediate knowledge in that moment that the computer does exist. The same thing is true for us in our relationship as people. When you see that you receive an email from me, the emails always have a timestamp on them, so it tells you at what time the email was sent. Now, not to be too moribund here, but if you see email that you get from me at 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, you would say, okay, that I know that Dr. Patrick existed at 4 o'clock Thursday afternoon because it's obvious he sent this email, and I have sense experience that he existed at that moment. But you wouldn't know if you're reading it at 6 o'clock, 2 hours later, if I still exist. Perhaps some awful accident had happened, and I'm no longer with us. And so you're only making the argument, according to John Locke, through probability, that because you see an email from 4 o'clock, you think it is very, very probable that I am still in existence 2 hours later at 6 o'clock. Now, as far as the religious realm is concerned with John Locke, he is someone who did believe in a divine figure, a deity figure, but many think that he is one of the earliest proponents of a religious philosophy that we call deism. By the way, you may find this interesting. The majority of what is often called the founding fathers of the United States were deists. They were not Orthodox Christians, but they were deists, and this is oftentimes referred to as the watchmaker theory of God, that God placed the world in existence, that God created the world, but then God has sort of faded off over the horizon of the cosmos and is not intimately involved with the world anymore. So in other words, the reason it's called the watchmaker theory is that you can you can hold a watch in your hand and you can see the second hand ticking, and you see that the watch is working, that it's keeping time, but the watchmaker may be on the other side of the world. The watchmaker is not someone who is very close to you, but the watch is evidence of his existence, that he brought this watch into being, and so therefore the watchmaker exists also. Now, this belief of deism does not say that God's existence, the belief that God's existence cannot be proved, but by just observing the universe. Again, remember, this goes back to this empiricism, observing the world, using your senses, that you see that the world has some sort of natural order. And so therefore Locke would say, even though we cannot absolutely prove God's existence, it would appear by what we witness in the world, what we witness in the cosmos, that it is very probable that a God does exist, that a God did create this universe, even though that God may be very far removed from the universe now. Okay, so it's a very important turn that we've taken today. We're now into this Enlightenment period. We've looked at John Locke, we've looked at Rene Descartes, and in your next lecture that will be coming in a few days, will be less than a week from now, we'll look at someone who kind of comes and he pulls the rug out from under both John Locke and Descartes' way of thinking with his school of thought called skepticism. So we will next turn to David Hume.